Thanks everybody for attending. This is the seminar for the Pardee Center. Topic today is climate change and contingent adaptation, the future of South Asian megacities. Our speaker is Madhu Dutta-Koehler, who's a professor in the Met College, a practicing architect, as well as having done this really fascinating research on adaptation in South Asian cities. We first heard a short version of highly condensed version of this talk at the conference that we did last fall on the future of Asian megacities in the 21st century, when Madhu was on one of the panels, and it was so fascinating. We wanted to make sure that we gave her an appropriate amount of time to talk about her research. So I'm really very, very excited by this. What I'd like to do is ask Madhu to come up and let's start.
Okay, great. Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here today to present my research, and a big hello to those who are out on the World Wide Web. I just wanted to set the stage for today's presentation with two very short clips which talk about climate events, but of very different nature, really. And the first clip is one from the recent climate march in NYC in 2014. So let me start with that, and then we'll go further. But just to give you some context, the two video clips are from two megacities which are across the world. And both of them are sort of adapting to climate change, but in very different ways. And the constraints they have are also very different. So essentially, there were almost 300,000 people in NYC for this climate march. And what was really, really exciting was to see the level of awareness and the enthusiasm that people had to address this. And especially, this was after Sandy. And so it kind of signifies the resilience that the people showed while they were sort of on this march and beyond. I believe also that this is the largest climate demonstration in the history of the US. So in that sense, it was pretty significant. And then the next one is a little less exuberant. And this one is a clip from Dhaka, actually from Bangladesh and parts of Dhaka in the flood which happened in 2007, I believe.
The effects of floods depend on where you live and the resources you have to deal with them. Being born in Bangladesh means you'll not only grow up in the most flood-prone country in the world, it also means you're likely to be poor. And that means you'll be less able to deal with floods when they inevitably arrive. In 1998, Bangladeshis experienced one of their worst ever floods. The children might look like they're having fun, but this flood made more than 30 million people homeless, and 2/3 of the country remained underwater for over 50 days. A decade later, many people are only just beginning to recover. But with climate change raising sea levels and affecting weather patterns, many believe events like this are about to become much more common.
So yes, events like this have really become much more common, both in Bangladesh and many of the South Asian megacities. So after the 2007 floods, there were floods in 2009, 2010, 2012, 2013, and so on. And these floods were huge. So there were days and days of rainfall, and then the entire country pretty much came to a standstill. Unfortunately, even after a decade, and even after a lot of awareness and work being done in Dhaka and the rest of Bangladesh and other cities across sort of South Asia, there's a lot of work still to be done, because Dhaka is not really able to adapt to a changing climate in the way we would like it to. What makes things even more dire is the fact that the cost of climate change is terribly expensive. From the most recent sort of research from the World Bank, they suggest that it's going to be almost, oh boy, $100 million is going to be the annual cost of adapting to climate change, and this is for a 2-degree rise. Sorry? Oh, I'm sorry.
Doctor Evil.
Yeah, I'm like, oh my God, that's a lot of zeros. Okay. So yes, so for a 2-degree centigrade rise in temperature till 2050, it's estimated that it's going to be almost a humongous cost, and something certainly places like Dhaka cannot seem to afford. So essentially what it boils down to really is that there's severe resource constraints, and the vulnerabilities that these kinds of cities have is tremendous. So how do you make this work? You're going to either perish or then you're going to adapt. So I guess my research in a certain sense sort of boils down really to this very issue where I'm trying to find a way to adapt to a changing climate while there are severe resource constraints among many other hurdles. So just to give you an idea of sort of, how much, at least financially, Dhaka and places like these are constrained, NYC has a budget, New York City has a budget of $75 billion annually. And its GDP is almost $1 trillion. Whereas in Bangladesh, the GDP is only $150 billion, and of that, 2/3 of the GDP is contributed by Dhaka. So essentially, there's absolutely no parity in terms of how much money Dhaka versus New York City could possibly spend. And so this brings me to sort of, set the stage for my talk today, where I look at climate adaptation in 2 cities, two South Asian megacities, Dhaka in Bangladesh and Kolkata in India. And just to go through very quickly about what I'm going to present, I'm going to start with a small introduction and then go on to give you a bit of the reasoning behind my case selection, if you will, and then briefly touch on my research approach and go on to talk about 3 projects essentially which I have highlighted from the big body of research that I have, and 2 of the projects are in Kolkata and 1 is in Dhaka. And the one in Kolkata, one of the ones in Kolkata is the one I'm going to go into greater detail about. And of course, last but not the least, the reason why we all do research is to find out what the implications are in terms of policy and practice. And so I hope to highlight some of that. And essentially, I'm in the process of trying to find an approach or a theory, if you will, which I name as contingent adaptation. So there's many megacities all over the world, and a lot of them are essentially concentrated in the South Asian or the East Asian region. And most of these, and if you look at the total population of these megacities, it's almost 2 billion urban dwellers that are facing the risks of climate change, if you will. And of course, there's a whole host of impacts from climate change. There's a whole set of vulnerabilities. And most importantly, what makes these vulnerabilities even worse is the fact that the rate of urbanization is very rapid. There's very weak institutional capacities, despite the best intentions of a lot of people. And last but not the least, and sort of this is my sort of variable, if you will, against which I test these, is the fact that these cities are really resource constrained. So of all the impacts of climate change, the problems in the water sector is what is going to be the most acute, if you will. And I found this really cool quote from Sean Tully in Forbes, nonetheless, where he says that water promises to be to the 21st century what oil is to the 20th century, the precious commodity that determines the wealth of nations. And believe me, Bangladesh has a lot of water, but there's a problem with the water, and I'll tell you as we move along. Essentially, research suggests that by 2025, about 2.5 billion people are going to be water stressed, and about 1.8 billion people are going to be have water scarcity. So just to give you a brief definition of what water stress versus water scarcity is, water stress is essentially the difficulty in finding fresh water when the supplies are debilitating or deteriorating. And water scarcity is essentially when demand exceeds supply, and this could be also because there's no money to actually buy the water or negotiate, and so on. So essentially, the bottom line then becomes that almost 60% of the world's population is going to be affected. And it certainly underscores the very gravity of the situation, that something needs to be done about it, and done about it very, very soon. So finding ways to adapt to climate change within existing resource constraints becomes essential. Not to beat a dead horse, but just trying to drive the point really home so that we can start to do something about it. So essentially, the meta question that drives the very research is that in the face of existing research constraints, what are the kinds of planning strategies that can be most effective in these kinds of cities in the global south? So before I go into sort of my research approach and findings and so on, I wanted to very briefly touch on the two cities that we'll be looking at, that I have looked at. And those are, again, Dhaka in Bangladesh and Kolkata in eastern India. And hopefully sort of talking about their vulnerabilities as well as the impacts that they have would provide some kind of context as to why these cities are good cases to study. So Dhaka, another thing to note is that in this area right here, this is the Indo-Gangetic Delta plain. This is one of the most fertile regions of the world. And most of this region, sort of food production, especially in the rice sector and so on, comes from this region. And given that there's going to be so many impacts, and I'm not going to sort of go through the list here, such as saltwater intrusion, there's going to be sedimentation, there's going to be land subsidence, and so on and so forth, really the food production is at peril here. And food security is becoming a bigger and bigger issue every year because of these changes. What is even worse is that they're estimating that Bangladesh, which once used to be one of the big exporters of rice, might actually have to go ahead and import rice from other countries because they no longer would be able to produce. So of all the problems that we have, there's a couple that I just want to underscore before I move on. And one is that if you look at sort of the top three things over here, the floods and drainage congestion is a big deal in the South Asian megacities, especially in Dhaka and Kolkata. Does anybody know what drainage congestion means? Essentially, it's when the stormwater system sort of reaches capacity and then the water starts to overflow and it starts to flood entire cities. So that's drainage congestion for you. And then, of course, water supply and quality are going to be deeply affected. And last but not the least, there's a severe destruction of the urban wetlands. One really, one fact that I read just before coming here was that there was a time when Dhaka city, almost 52% of Dhaka city used to consist of wetlands. And now, as of 2008, the satellite images in 2008, about 40% of the entire wetlands of Dhaka have completely gone. And this is because of overdevelopment. And what that does is it creates a lot of surface runoff, the groundwater cannot be recharged, and a whole host of things which I won't even get into, but it's also on an earthquake fault, which makes it even more vulnerable. So you name it and they have it. They have all the problems. But you know, at a more sort of, if I look at my control variables, the reason that I chose Dhaka and Kolkata, not only because they have similar vulnerabilities, but also in terms of its geography, topography, the kind of development, the rate of urbanization, overdevelopment, and so on. So these cities have a lot of things in common. So in a way, the way they would respond would also hopefully be similar in that sense. So the task at hand was to find planning initiatives that also address climate issues without sort of the need for additional resources. And that sort of goes to the question which is posed right here, which drives the entire research, if you will. So when I started to look at different planning projects as well as planning initiatives, both in Dhaka and Kolkata, I was looking for some very specific things that might eventually shed light on how planners are going to adapt to climate change when they really don't have much resources to do so. So the idea was that I wanted to find adaptation approaches which had the ability to overcome resource constraints and also institutional limitations, and of course would have a higher likelihood of adaptation. So we found that anything that was a standalone climate adaptation project never really got onto the front burner, if you will, because there was always something more to be done. So we needed to find sort of projects which were entrenched in the system itself, and so that they would be addressed quickly. And last but not the least, of course, context is essential. So there was no way that some other thing that worked in another part of the world could actually be applied, because the institutional constraints, the resources, the way things were done were very, very different. Okay. So in terms of my research approach, I looked at a couple of theories, of course, and there were some which sort of I draw from, and one of them is development as adaptation, which essentially talks about the fact that you need to reduce your overall vulnerability, if you will, if you are going to be able to adapt. And this is very evident when you remember the first two videos from Dhaka and New York City, is that New York City has a lot more resilience, so it's able to bounce back much more quickly, as opposed to Dhaka, which has been just sort of in deluge after deluge, floods after floods, and they barely are able to recover before the next flood or the next climate extremity happens. The other theory that I looked at was the disaster risk reduction theories. And essentially, there is a kind of synergy in some aspects of disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation. So for example, if you are going to adapt to the climate in a city, you need to create, an evacuation route. And that kind of planning is very similar to when you want to sort of do a disaster risk reduction as well. So there's certain synergies over there that one can draw from. My research was about 2 years, a little more actually, if you count the literature review and other sorts of stuff. I went around both these cities and looked at sort of did about over 90 semi-structured field interviews. I have to stop for a moment because there's this really cool story I have to tell you. I just remembered. So this was my last day in Dhaka and was the last trip, field trip for my research. And that day, actually, the entire city went on strike. And so there were absolutely no vehicles on the road. People were burning cars and so on and so forth. And, you know, I had to get out the next day because I had a flight back to Boston the day after. So I had to get from Dhaka to Delhi and so on. So I still remember that I called some people up that I had set up interviews, and they said, well, we can't come to the office. But they said, you can come to our home if you want. We're happy to speak to you. And so I had my computer in hand. I kind of covered myself and sat in a cycle rickshaw. And the guy was really good because every time we would see like a burning car or a mob of people, he would go into one of the side streets. But boy, am I glad that I went and spoke with these people, because they were not busy that day. They were at home. And they spoke to me at length and gave me wealth of information, which I adopted later on. And then, of course, last but not the least, each of the projects had an extensive evaluation criteria for which they had to pass muster, if you will. Okay. I think I might be going too fast, but hey, we will have more time for Q&A, you know? Okay, so I looked at a large number of planning projects and planning initiatives, and those especially that had the potential or then the actual adaptive capacity to make a difference. And of these, like I mentioned earlier, I picked 3 specific projects for this presentation, and the first 2 are located in Dhaka and the last one in Kolkata. So after the devastating floods of 1989 and 1998 in Bangladesh, and just to give you an idea of the amount of devastation, almost 2/3 of the entire country was underwater for over 2 months. And there were 30 million people who were completely displaced and homeless. And a lot of them actually left the country and migrated to India and other places, which is why there's another whole problem of climate refugees and so on. So at that time, when all these floods were taking place, there was this large infrastructure project which was going on in Dhaka, which was called the Dhaka Integrated Flood Protection Project. So they had gotten a lot of money from the ADB, gotten some assistance from the World Bank and so on. And so essentially it was just a capital improvement project. But what really sort of sets this apart was that somewhere between the conception and the planning of it, and even the initial sort of implementation of it, because of all these floods, they decided to put in what I would essentially term as climate filters. So they said, okay, we want to make this project work, but we want to also make this project work so that it actually contributes to some kind of climate adaptation. And so to do that, what they did was they, raised the elevation of the highway so that if there were floods, the main highway of the city wouldn't get flooded. They did a lot of slum upgradation, which increased the resilience of the people. They did a lot of environmental improvements. And then, of course, last but not the least, they upgraded the storm and sewer infrastructure, which actually greatly helped with the drainage congestion. So essentially, what started off as a capital improvement project by some minor tweaks and very little addition to the budget, if you will, really helped Dhaka along. And it took about 12 years for the integrated flood protection project to get over. And after that, the next flood that came, lo and behold, at least that area in Dhaka was not flooded. There was no storm congestion, or even if there was, it was little puddles as opposed to water till here. So it worked. And there's photographs to prove it if you guys want to see at any point. So the other project that I want to talk about is from Dhaka Wasa, which is the Dhaka water, Water and Sewer Association, if you will, or something like that. And essentially, the DWASA is a very, very unique model for any kind of public organization. So essentially, it answers to the central government or the government of the city, but runs autonomously without any interference. So there's a lot less bureaucracy, if you will. And for climate adaptation to work, you need champions. And the head of DWASA was certainly a champion for climate adaptation. And he ran the whole organization along the lines of a corporate entity. So there was, budget balancing and so on and so forth, and completely sort of changed the ideology of the company, and it became rather professional in nature than bureaucratic, which certainly helped. And I only say this because I wanted to also underscore that the institutional limitations such as bureaucracy, lack of expertise, of things running so slow, these kinds of things really affect most planning projects, but most importantly, it affects climate adaptation, because you need to adapt yesterday. And if you're going to take 10 more years to reach a decision, then you're essentially stuck for a very long time and probably won't make it. So essentially, the DWASA turnaround program, what they did was they created meters all over the city, made sure that there was enough revenue generation to do the things they wanted to do. And then they looked at a couple of things. One was to create the surface treatment plants so that they were protected from the floods. They moved it sufficiently away so that they were not in the way of any kind of land subsidence and things like that. So the networks were very well structured to stay away from the flood-prone zones. It actually increased the surface water supply, which was a really, really big thing because most of Dhaka before this project used to rely on groundwater. And the problem with groundwater, there's many problems with groundwater, and I'll just sort of mention two. The first one is that the more groundwater that you take out, you deplete the water table. And when you start to deplete the water table, the little bit of arsenic that remains in the soil, now, it's not diluted as much because there's less water. So there were lots of people dying or falling sick because of arsenic poisoning, which is why surface water becomes sort of the alternative, if you will. And then the other thing is that one was the groundwater, and the other thing is that also if you do rely on surface water, especially in Dhaka, if you're able to clean it up, it's a big supply of water, because the way Dhaka is structured, it's kind of the city here, and it has 4 big rivers which crisscross it, which means that you have abundant water supply. But of course, at the same time, when it rains, it pours, and both figuratively and literally it does. So it floods all over, and it creates a huge problem. So essentially, with this DWASA turnaround program, which I believe there were some companies in Japan who aided with both the technology and the money, they were able to increase the potable water supply, they were able to generate revenue, they were able to reduce the groundwater withdrawal, and of course, last but not the least, start to regenerate the water tables, because even if you have an extensive network in the urban area, there are certainly slum areas where you don't have that kind of network, and people still rely on groundwater. And if the if the water table is recharged, then the possibility of arsenic contamination reduces significantly. So now for the feature project of our afternoon. This is my very favorite project, really, because it's unique. It treads so very lightly on the earth, and also in so many ways it sort of addresses the institutional limitations and the resource constraints. So for those of you who might be familiar with Kolkata, and I was speaking to some people in the audience who actually have lived and worked there, one of the largest wetland systems in South Asia are in the city of Kolkata. And Kolkata, just to remind you, is the capital of a state in eastern India. The state is called West Bengal, and Kolkata is essentially the capital of that state. So it's huge to the point, it's about 12,500 hectares. And just to give you an idea, 1 hectare is a little more than about 2 football fields. Yes, I've been integrated into football since I've been here. So that, or being a football widow every football season, so why not join them? So anyway, so the whole network of sort of these wetland systems, it's not just one giant marsh, it's little streams and brooks and water bodies which are both man-made as well as natural, and then of course there's salt marshes and other sort of retention ponds and so on. So the whole area is a collection of these kinds of water bodies and marshes that come together and create the wetland system. Okay. So, in a sense, if we step back for a minute before I go into the details of the EKWS project, East Kolkata Wetland Systems Project, everybody loves abbreviating in South Asia, really, so I got into the habit there. But essentially, it really does a couple of things that we are looking for in a good adaptation project, which is integrated into mainstream planning. Namely, it works within the existing resource and institutional contexts and constraints. It has a higher likelihood of adoption because it's something that people already want to do. So it's easy to kind of take the other parameters into the fold and work with it. And last but not the least, and you'll see in a second in the next slide or two, that it fits within the environmental and social context of the place, because this is something everybody was on board with and all the stakeholders came together, which is essential to make a project work, not only at that time, but in the future as well. So essentially, what this project was about, and let me sort of just go on to the next slide, and no, let's start here. Okay, so if I were to very quickly try and explain this very, very unique system to you guys, imagine that there's a whole set of sort of water bodies which are almost sort of, which are spread out, but at the same time there's almost a linear flow which goes from one sort of retention pond or one lake to another. And what they do is that whenever there is flooding in the city or around the city in that area, they have sort of desilted all the canals that are adjacent to this water body system, and they have rerouted them, they have sort of strengthened the trunk sewer lines and so on. And so, you know, whatever doesn't go into that sort of existing infrastructure which has been improved automatically starts to feed into this canal system or this water body system. And so the first step is that there's a lot of non-purified water, essentially, which has a lot of solid waste particles and so on and so forth. And they found that within a certain length of it going through a water body, it starts to wash itself off and purify itself, which is a really good thing. So then the sort of semi-purified water goes into the next section of this whole wetland system. And when it does, it actually is converted into fish farms where there's a lot of local fish farming. Because now the dilution is so less of the solid waste particles that it actually becomes great fertilizer and great sort of nutrients for the fish. So fish farming becomes a big thing. And then last but not the least, after sort of it goes through these whole sort of fish farms and things like that, the water then flows further, and at this time it now becomes pure enough that, and it's debatable, you know, the WHO standards for the developing world is very different, or is, you know, different from those in the developed world, but the water in the third stage is now used to for irrigation, and there's a whole sets of vegetable patches and things like that all around. And what that did is it created a lot of employment for the people around, for farmers over there, and also Kolkata now has some of the cheapest fish and vegetables in the entire country. So which is really a good thing, because we are always looking to locally source our food. So this slide essentially is some pictures of what I just explained to you. And just to give you an idea, there's about 13,000 tons of fish and 150 tons of vegetables which are being produced every single day. And what this does is the project simultaneously improves water quality. It aids the economic development in the region itself. It reduces the need for any costly sewage treatment plants, because now you don't have to have a lot of them, because you can use the water system to sort of purify your water. And of course, last but not the least, it reduces drainage congestion or flooding in the city or in that area of the city, and it contributes to food production. So I actually had among my interviews, I also spoke with many of the farmers around that area, and there were a couple of concerns, just to be sort of transparent about the findings. There were a couple of concerns that they raised. The first was that, is this water pure enough for us to be able to sort of feed it to our plants? Because the food that we eat, it could essentially be contaminated. But so far, all's been well. There's been more food poisoning if you eat at a fancy restaurant in Kolkata than the fruit and vegetables here. So I think we're okay for now. And the other thing was that the farmers, there was a lot of squatters in that area over there, and when a lot of them were sort of removed because they wanted to extend the network of the storm and sewer system, there was a lot of complaints about that, and there were a lot of activists who came into the scene and made sure that the people who were displaced actually got some of their land back and little portions of farmland, so that they could actually survive economically and well, and were not affected by the displacement itself. So essentially, what EKWS did and why it's unique, or rather why it's similar to the kinds of projects that I found which help with the matter of climate adaptation, is that there's a reduction in the impacts of flooding due to intense precipitation and drainage congestion. This is like a big, big thing. It's like every week, if there's rain, the entire city gets flooded. So it's important to identify and preserve natural drainage areas, and this project certainly did. And the part of the extension, rerouting, and desiltation of canals were already in progress. So the city planning authorities were already working on these. So when the climate filters were put into the project, the whole adaptation part also became part of the larger planning initiative. And last but not the least, and I know I've spoken about this before, but it's important to note that the city absolutely had no money for any treatment plants or anything. And the old treatment plants were really old, broken, they were barely getting by, and this was becoming a big issue. And with the EKWS project, essentially they didn't have to build sort of the 3 or 4 treatment plants that they had decided that they were going to do. Okay. So if I look at the from all these projects that I have studied and the 3 that I have shown you, there are some very real implications for planning and practice. So essentially, the findings suggest that if you couple planning objectives related to climate change and development at the same time and try to find the synergies, then there is a higher likelihood that projects which are for climate adaptation can actually work. Also, they are also the projects that are going to be prioritized. They're going to be funded before anything else. And the implementation crew that is already existing can also address these very same issues. And then, of course, one needs the climate adaptation strategies and specific measures that can easily be identified and integrated are the ones that are most likely to be adopted. So you need the synergy. You need to find where the synergy is, and you also need to find you need to identify the projects where you can put these climate filters in so that you can integrate it into the mainstream capital projects and so on. It's important to note that these kinds of policies, implications for policy and practice, don't necessarily solve the entire problem of climate adaptation in this region. But what they do is they give us hope that one step at a time, and most importantly, right now, there are ways to address some of the larger issues before it becomes it blows up in your face. And so, though it might seem like low-hanging fruit, though it might not seem like a grand project which is going to change the way we look at climate change overnight, these little steps which actually work and they actually change the system go a long way to increasing the resilience and decreasing the vulnerability of cities such as this. So a couple of things, and I've highlighted them in red right over here, is that the most effective and readily applicable approaches are those that factor development and adaptation at the same time. And what that does is that the resources that are allocated for regular development can also simultaneously be used for adaptation. So that's where the money comes from, if you will. And last but not the least, such projects are already part of ongoing planning initiatives. So there's already a momentum created. They're already happening. They're already on ground. So you don't need extra resources. You don't need a lot of expertise. You don't need extra money. You don't need to convince the planning agencies that they actually need to work on this. Because in a way, these kinds of projects with these simple climate filters are viewed as part of everyday work for most of these planning agencies. So in a way, all this research suggests that there might be a way there might be ways within the existing planning agenda where climate adaptation can be integrated. And this approach works within the many constraints that I have noted earlier, such as political, economic, technical, and cities in the developing world need to find these kinds of solutions which benefits a multiple number of stakeholders all at the same time, and fulfills many objectives because it's impossible to have standalone projects at this time. So just to go back to the definition itself on contingent adaptation, and it's kind of a working definition, if you will. So I term contingent adaptation, or I define it as a planning approach that articulates adaptive criteria at its inception. So it's you still have the capital projects, but you already have some of the adaptation criteria in mind before you start. It fulfills specific long-term adaptation goals, such as flood control and so on. And in the interim, it serves as a substitute for any kind of dedicated adaptation planning. So there is an absence of any kind of adaptation planning, or even if there is, it's not as robust and it really hasn't made that big a difference. So contingent adaptation in a way acts as a substitute till the South Asian megacities can come to a point where they can actually have standalone measures such as these. And of course, the precise elements of this kind of approach is contingent upon the development goals. So it depends whether you want to work on water supply, whether you want to have sewer and water infrastructure and so on. So it's contingent upon those kinds of things. And last but not the least, I just wanted to say that why this approach seems to be a robust one, and I've been sort of testing it in other ways too in my ongoing research, is that it extends the argument of adaptation as development, which is something that the entire sort of adaptation community of adaptation scholars are furthering at this time. It provides a good contextual approach, so it's not something that is just sort of planted from one place to another. It focuses on local actors and processes, and so you can build capacity very easily in that sense, works within existing resource constraints, and last but not the least, it understands the mechanisms and approaches that are already in place and uses them in very unique ways to create adaptation measures that actually work. So, great. Thank you.
So Madhu, you focus a lot on these planning activities, and so what will the future hold? What's the prospect for them, to be implemented over really what will amount to decades of time, and sort of being able to see the degree to which they actually work?
So you mean the actual planning projects which are sort of fall in the domain of contingent adaptation? So, the ones that I looked at, I think I started with an initial list of 43, if I remember correctly, and of which I really only selected about 21 or so. I think the last count was 19. And those 19 projects have worked quite well. And, and even without sort of the adaptation piece attached to it, most of these projects have certainly helped to increase the resilience of these cities. And more importantly, if you go to these cities and sort of the research suggests, and as well as what we see on the ground, it suggests that it's almost climate adaptation is so far out in the horizon, despite there being a lot of work and activity and awareness around it, that really on the ground, it's only projects like this which are working towards sort of adapting to a changing climate. So in a sense, I suspect that it's going to catch on and catch on widely, and certainly till sort of these cities reach a point where it's either adapt or completely perish. I think this is here to stay, and this is probably I don't want to make large claims, but this is certainly one of the most practical ways to be able to address these issues. Oh, thank you. Actually, Deepthi was so kind to give me that. Thank you.
Madhu,
I'm sorry, I'm listening.
no, I wanted to make sure you were all together there. The Kolkata story is very inspiring, but a lot of the problem has to do, or at least the story goes, has to do with deforestation in the upper watershed. Has anyone adopted a systems approach for the entire watershed, or is there at least a conception of several of these projects being critically located so that they have synergistic effects?
So, I don't think that there is a master plan for a watershed in this region, but that's it. It's a master plan. It never sort of gets into any kind of any semblance of being translated into some kind of project which actually works. So that part is, the answer would be no. There is no consideration of a larger thing. But the one thing to be noted is that after the East Kolkata Wetland Systems project, where they saved a lot of money, they got a lot of publicity, and a lot of things worked. There were many other similar sort of cities, and Dhaka being one of them, because Dhaka at one point, 50% of Dhaka city used to be wetlands similar to those in Kolkata. So since then, they have certainly started to pay more attention to conserving this. And unfortunately, of the 50% of the wetland systems in Dhaka, already 40% of that is gone. So whatever is left, they're seriously trying to conserve it because they know from sort of projects such as the Kolkata Wetland System project that this is going to work, and this is going to work cheaply and easily. And so now they're trying to sort of remove a lot of, in most of these wetland systems, there's a lot of slums and things like that, encroachment and so on. So they're trying to clear it up, create sort of conserve it, and pass laws that you can't sort of build on it and so on. And more importantly, I think that they are trying to create similar systems. And actually, it's not a lot of effort to do so. It's just that you need it cleared enough and well to be able to, assemble this together.
Yeah, but while all this great stuff is going on along the coast, where the threat is immediate and existential, more trees are being cut in the uplands. I mean, I have a friend who works in India, Kamal Bawa, and we've despaired at the lack of attention to the other end of the river. Yeah. Why not have a project of this spirit and, scalable in a reasonable way at the other end?
I have nothing against it, really. I'm all for it. I'm all for it. Hey, I'll even suggest it to, the powers that be if I can. And I completely agree. I think, the more important thing is, and something that you've hit upon, is the fact that, if you were to look at the other end of the river, and if you were to look at sort of the levels of deforestation and how to cut it down, or completely sort of change the way in which sort of trees are cut and then regrown, that's also another very, very simple intervening strategy.
Yeah, it makes money. And
yeah, which will
It's
absolutely help. And it will address the thing about resource constraints, but at the same time, which will help to adapt to climate. So I think perhaps, and you give me an idea here, I think perhaps, apart from looking at sort of these projects that are here, which work, and which are already sort of part of the planning schema, if you will, maybe we need to start identifying these kinds of projects that we could do, which would easily integrate adaptation goals and yet, serve a larger purpose.
And the wonderful
Yeah?
thing is, all of Asia, not just South Asia, but South and Southeast Asia, come together
Yes,
in the Himalayas.
yes.
It's
yes.
all there in a very few countries.
And I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah.
I'm kind of thinking at the other end of the spectrum, which is how do we get the businesses involved? I'm aware of the project of moving the Spalding Hospital, and they had to make a lot of changes that previous building codes didn't encompass. For example, building berms to deal with flooding oceans and putting all their infrastructure on the roof instead of in the basement. Is there any evidence in these two cities of using building codes and then imposing known adaptations to dealing with climate change that could increase their resilience, even if they are going to flood?
Right. I think at the building level per se, in terms of codes, and it's a great question because sort of I have an architecture background, so this is close to my heart. At the level of building codes, the codes are all there. And the codes make absolute sense, so there's codes where when you're in a certain sort of 100-year flood, well, not 100-year floodplain, but 500-year floodplain, if you're building, then you want to leave the lower floor open and so on and so forth. So the problem is not really the laws or the policies or the codes, and I think, of course, they can be made better. The problem is the implementation. And, everywhere you go, one of the things that, it sort of screams at you is the corruption in the system. So no matter the best laid efforts and the best intentions always fall flat, because it doesn't matter if you have a building code, you just pay somebody a certain amount of money and you build. Now, what is happening, and this is really good to note, is that over the years in a lot of these areas where there were wetlands, especially in Dhaka city, they were also located on sort of the earthquake faults. And I want to say in the past 10 years, there have been at least, and I'm going to be wrong here, but just to estimate, about 6 or 7 huge building collapses where hundreds of people have died. And essentially, and that has created so much sort of media attention, and their eyes are focused on them, that now they are at least trying, or not trying, but they're at least sort of clamped down and not let any kind of development occur where it shouldn't. So, it's not adaptation per se, but certainly it's a small step. But that's about how far they've gone, which is why, and I don't mean to make it all sound dire, because there's some very bright people, they're doing their best. Strangely enough, a lot of the adaptation efforts, standalone adaptation efforts, which work and work really well, are not the ones in the cities. They're the ones which are, the slide where I showed of the Indo-Gangetic Delta area right near the coast and so on. So there's a lot of mangrove forests which are being saved. There's a lot of saltwater intrusion, and for that they're trying to understand how to create channels which will divert the water. So they are doing a lot, even the kinds of crops that they are growing, so in some places the water has become so brackish that you can't grow rice anymore. And so they've gone to sort of other kinds of cash crops and so on and so forth. So over there, the adaptation measures are somewhat standalone, and they're working really hard because, that's the frontier, if you will, and they have to do something there. Otherwise, the entire region is going to perish. But in the cities, not yet. And sadly enough, there's these cities, Dhaka has a population of 20 million people, and that's underestimating. And so if something happens, it happens to 20 million people and beyond. So it's important to address it at the city level. Yeah?
Can you talk about how scalable these projects are, and give us an idea of how much of it is happening? So if the scale of the issue is 100, is this happening in like 5% of the area? Because it's probably some of these projects are run by non-profit organizations, or are they by the government?
No, the projects that I've looked at, all of them are through the city planning agencies, yes. So,
how widespread are they? And sort of a related question, who owns the land that these wetlands are being formed in?
So, that's the easiest question because it's a direct one. And for the area of the East Kolkata wetland systems, the city owns most of the land, which was a good thing. And the land that the city didn't own, they actually acquired. And the rest of the people who they could bully, they bullied and tried to throw out. But the activists came into the picture. So in that sense, in this particular instance at least, it was easier because you didn't have to sort of fight about land control issues and so on. In terms of sort of just looking at the, let me see. Not this. I was going to show you the extent of these kinds of cities and things like that. Okay, there's the slide. Okay. So, just sort of in the Southeast Asian region and South Asia and so on, and I haven't marked most of them in the Southeast Asian region, most of the sort of climate impacts, vulnerabilities, and so on are very similar, as is sort of this nature of the cities in terms of their topography and things. So if we were to take things like looking at wetland systems as a way to adapt, then certainly there's a huge scope over here to do so. But even before we do that, I think we need to identify and stop the overdevelopment before we can even start to make this viable. Yeah.
Within the cities, if you take Dhaka,
Oh, I see, I see.
you know, how,
I got you.
how much of this problem is being resolved or solved by these particular climate
Right.
adaptation projects?
Right. So, I don't have a bigger map of Kolkata, but if you look at East Kolkata, the way Kolkata is laid out, the land kind of all slopes towards the east. So what was happening was that all the water that was sort of collected didn't have before the wetland systems was regenerated, didn't have a way to leave. And so essentially this has affected at least sort of 5 to 10 mile radius, depending on the topography, that area doesn't get flooded anymore.
So you think that
So-
say 50% of the city
I-
is being impacted?
I would say realistically, I mean, if you look at, then again, there's a definition of the city and the city, right? So if you're just looking at sort of the critical boundaries of just the city proper, I would say at least 50%. But then because of the rate of urbanization and the spread of settlements, if you look at the greater Kolkata area, then probably it's 10% maybe. But then this is not the only project that they're
But in
working on.
aggregate, so
Yeah,
I'm saying,
I
if you
wanna
took all
say-
the projects
Yes.
together,
Together.
would you say they are, so it sounds like they are
I
having
would say
great
about
impact.
20% certainly. In the Dhaka turnaround, the water supply project in Dhaka, that completely changed the face of Dhaka city proper, the whole networks and things like that. So I would say at least 80% of the city, certainly, you got running water, you had potable water supply, which was not contaminated for once, because they also started to get revenues to be able to do that. Because that's another big thing is you don't have enough money, so you have to find a way to, meter things and stuff.
So those are very encouraging numbers.
Yeah,
I mean, I thought it would be like
certainly.
1 or 2%, but if you're saying it is
No,
pretty
no,
widespread.
it's a lot,
That's
because
great.
these are really large capital improvement
great,
projects,
thanks.
yeah.
Is there anyone else? Okay. Madhu, the big conservation organizations and the World Conservation Union recently all changed their tune from resisting mass extinction to focusing on benefits for people as the avenue to saving biodiversity. And aside from climate change, the loss of biodiversity is the other big crisis we're dealing with. The area that we were discussing today is the last hope for the Asian elephant, for the tiger, and for several species of bears.
And actually, there's a particular dolphin.
The Ganges River dolphin
Yes.
is critical.
It's critical. I read this beautiful book, and if you guys ever get a chance, you should read it, called The Hungry Tide. And it's brilliant, and it talks a lot about this biodiversity and so on.
So given that,
Yeah.
has there been a synergy between the work of conservation organizations and urban planners, or are they on two different planets?
Yeah. I think you answered your own question.
Can we do something about that? Because these guys funnel a lot of philanthropic.
Yes.
These guys
No.
they're a stream of philanthropic support.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
can put us over the top.
Yeah. No, unfortunately, it seems like, already, I mean, there just seems to be enough political space for just a few organizations at a time. Otherwise, it becomes very chaotic, or at least it seems like that. So do we want more cooperation? Absolutely. But is it likely to happen in the near run? Perhaps in small instances. Where once again, well, I don't mean to be, pessimistic, because, the whole point of doing this research was to find a hopeful path to solving the problem. But, there's the literature suggests that these kinds of collaborations, such as between NGOs and public agencies, happen when there are champions within the organizations and the agencies. And so if you have sort of climate champions, if you will, those are the people who spearhead and create the connections. So that's sort of what,
Actually, I have a question. So you mentioned corruption and some of the other institutional issues. So what was it in terms of the context of the Dhaka Water and Sewer Authority, and you just referenced again sort of leadership, but what was it, do you think, that made that opportunity successful? I mean, you can have somebody who's really dynamic and great, but if they're up against bigger forces, they can't be effective. So was there something there that can be replicated elsewhere, or was it?
I think the model can be replicated, but the set of circumstances unlikely. I'm not sure if it can be or not, but the model itself can be. So essentially, one of the first things that the Dhaka Water and Sewer Authorities did was that they sort of, when they came into existence, or not when they came into existence, but when this head of the Diwasa took over, he actually had a lot of political clout already and was very respected. And so he was able to negotiate that if I'm going to run this and run this well, I will have absolutely no interference for the first 3 years, and so either I'm going to do that or I'm going to walk away. And so he was given, his organization was given sort of autonomous position within the milieu of the different public agencies within the city. And that certainly helped, because for every little thing, he didn't get a call from the minister saying, hey, get this done, when there were other more pressing issues.
Right.
So that was...
So where did that power base come from that enabled him to do that? Was it, a populist movement? Was it sort of a recognition from the other managers, or?
It was a political negotiation, and essentially the authority was bestowed on him and his organization through the central government of Bangladesh. Because though, Dhaka is a city by itself, because it's also the capital of the country, the central government sort of works very closely with the local Dhaka agencies as well. And to speak to the corruption part, I think that, a lot of times, and I'm not sort of excusing it, but a lot of the corrupt practices happen because people are just trying to survive, or, get by, or whatever, or at least a small part of that is because of that. And there's no money to do anything. And so the first, even before he got into any of these capital improvements and things like that, the first thing he did was he tried to solidify a channel of sort of garnering resources. And so he, they got meters, got meters from this Japanese company, and they metered the entire sort of network so that the revenue could be collected. They set up systems, a 24-hour hotline, customer service, web-based interaction, and so on. And that really helped to create a steady revenue stream. And then they were able to, so then corruption was no longer an issue, because everything was transparent and everything was above board, and you had to sort of, there were so many eyes on you, if you will. So, oh, good. No questions. No, I'm just kidding. Yes.
So one thing that caught my mind was that you spoke about there was a certain population that got displaced by the wetland project, and that through some organizing or activism, they were actually able to benefit from it.
Yes.
Could you speak a little bit as to how that happened and whether or not you've seen that happen in other projects? Because just as framing, one of the things that worries me about tying climate adaptation projects to large international capital development projects is that the most vulnerable populations may get thrown under the bus, and any notion of equity may go out the window.
Yes, and then to add to that, it is exactly those people who are the most vulnerable, right? Because the really, yes, well, because the really rich people can always migrate till such time that they have to migrate somewhere else. It happens all the time that people are displaced. This is one of those rare instances where, because the project got so much publicity, and because sort of the eyes of the entire state and the country were on the project at that time, that it was hard to get away with sort of displacing people just for the hell of it. And also West Bengal and Kolkata, and those who are familiar with the city, and I'm a Bengali myself, so there's a really vein of activism in us, or in the people there, and so there's already a very sort of radical group of activists who don't want to see this happen. So they certainly champion the rights of the displaced people, and they got them plots of land. Does it happen everywhere? No. Does it happen all the time? Yes. Should we change it? Absolutely. But I'm sorry, I can't give you a better answer. Yeah. Great.